car. It's just a fascinating area, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's 2032, so close.
I know.
So close, yes it is.
I'm gonna launch my car up and down the motorway now. I'm gonna do burnouts.
Good on you. Adam on it. Linda Hallinan, thank you very much. Back tomorrow.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere nei, fewer than 20,000 people have had a double dose of the Pfizer vaccine. So does our immunisation program need a shot in the arm to reach rollout goals? Privilege puts some Auckland DHB members at the front of the vaccine queue when only 50% of their frontline staff have had the jab. We're dusting the welcome mat off for Australia, but growers are desperate for Pacific borders to open. The Health Minister supports it, so does the DG. So why is there no money for a self-swab cervical screening program? The outspoken movie director who called on New Zealand to ditch dairy for the planet's sake is grazing hundreds of cows, and more on a special bird bone discovery.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata with DNA. The National Party says New Zealand has fallen far short of its original target for the COVID vaccine rollout. About 90,000 doses have so far been administered, slightly behind the Health Ministry's official plan. But National's COVID response spokesperson Chris Bishop says a leaked ministry document from January shows a plan to have 390,000 doses administered by now.
We are just not vaccinating people as quickly as we should be.
The COVID-19 response minister, Chris Hipkins, says the document is out of date and does not take into account the government's change in strategy to focus solely on the Pfizer vaccine. The Director General of Health is also defending the speed of the rollout. Ashley Bloomfield says that unlike countries dealing with large community outbreaks, New Zealand has been able to take a measured and steady approach.
We've been in a very fortunate and hard-won position of being COVID-free, and we don't want to take our eye off the ball. So the vaccination program is rolling out in that context, and I think a good comparison is Australia, who is also rolling out at a similar, very similar rate.
147 of the New Zealanders initially given the vaccine had adverse reactions to it. Dr Bloomfield says 3 of the cases were considered serious, all of them involving an allergic reaction of some kind, but none needed hospital treatment and there have been no ongoing problems. Initial data from MedSafe up to March the 6th that shows the most commonly reported adverse reaction was dizziness, followed by headaches, nausea and fainting. Meanwhile, all 86 applications for early access to the vaccine have been approved for people who need to travel overseas for reasons deemed to be of national significance. Dr Bloomfield says most of them are Olympic athletes and there have also been some diplomats. He says 23 of the 41 applications for early access on compassionate grounds have been approved so far. The Health and Disability Commissioner has found systemic failure in the way Pharmax medicine brand switches are communicated to patients. Morag McDowell says she is taking action in response to 3 patients' complaints that they were not told Pharmac was switching their brand of epilepsy medicine in 2019.
I believe the complaints show that there is a systemic issue relating to how the brand change was communicated to consumers. And given the potential for ongoing risk and for this to happen again in the future, I've written to the Director General of Health to outline my concerns.
Pharmac says it went to considerable lengths to inform patients about the brand switch, but is happy to work with the Ministry of Health to improve its processes. A petition calling for a national women's health strategy has been delivered to MPs. The petitioners want $6 million set aside for the purpose in this year's budget. A spokesperson for the lobby group Gender Justice Collective, Angela Meyer, says the health system is failing women because it is based on the needs of a 70-kilogram white male.
Women's bodies are complicated, that's often what they're said. And so it's very easy to go, okay, we're going to put that in the too hard basket. Now, whether that's sexism, whether that's the patriarchy, well, I think it's both of those things, if I'm really honest. And I think this is where we're actually calling it out, we're naming it, and we're saying we want better.
Angela Meyer says an urgent Select Committee inquiry into women's health is also needed. The United States is running short of tomato ketchup. Heinz, which produces the most popular brand, says it's been unable to keep up with surging demand for sachets of the sauce, although it is now boosting production. Customers' reluctance to share bottles of ketchup on restaurant tables appears to account for soaring sachet sales. There's also been a big increase in the purchase of takeaway food during the pandemic. It's 4 minutes past 5. The White Ferns have taken a flurry of wickets as Australia's innings nears a close in the second cricket one-day in Mount Maunganui. Australian Vice-Captain Rachel Haynes set the platform for her side, scoring 87. In her 200th game, opener Alyssa Healy made 44 and captain Meg Lanning 49. Spinner Lee Kasparek has taken 4 wickets for the Ferns after rejoining the team for today's game. A short time ago, Australia were 255 for 5 off 47 overs. New Zealand Rugby says it's developing contingency plans for the Trans-Tasman Super Rugby competition should the travel bubble between Australia and Aotearoa burst. The tournament is set to start in Dunedin on May 14th, with the 5 New Zealand teams playing the 5 Australian teams before a final scheduled for June the 19th. NZR's Chris Lendrum says if there's a COVID outbreak or border restrictions are reinstated, the competition will have to be adjusted.
We're hoping that a 6-week tournament can go off without a hitch. It's possible it might not. The beauty of the competition start date, which is still over a month away, is we get to see the bubble open, we get to learn a lot over the first few weeks, and that will inform our contingency planning.
New Zealand paracyclist Emma Foy has decided to retire. Foy won a silver and a bronze at the 2016 Rio Paralympics and also won 5 world titles on the track and 1 on the road during her 7-year career. That's the news.
The Australians are coming.
Kiwis will be welcoming Aussies, and all in time for Anzac Day too.
One grandma is very happy.
My grandkids are so big that they'll be past me, they'll be taller than me.
So are New Zealand ski fields.
The Australians always come out in force. They love getting over to Queenstown, so we're looking forward to seeing plenty of them over here.
But it's not quite enough for some.
I don't understand why we don't have a Pacific bubble. That is something where the government needs to move on this.
Popping the bubble. Morning reports, weekdays from 6 on air and online.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Taranaki, also Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Taupo. Fine spells, isolated showers, then clearing south of Auckland tonight. Isolated showers returning in the south tomorrow afternoon. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa partly cloudy. A few showers about Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, mainly about the ranges. Isolated afternoon showers in Wairarapa tomorrow. Taihape to Wellington, fine apart from areas of low cloud or fog morning and night. Isolated afternoon and evening showers about and north of Manawatu tomorrow. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller and Westland, fine apart from areas of low cloud or fog morning and night. Canterbury and Otago, excluding Clutha, areas of cloud with some drizzle about the coast and plains, clearing tomorrow morning, fine further inland. Clutha, Southland and Fiordland, cloudy periods and a few showers about the fiords and the south coast. And Chatham Islands, fine spells. RNZ National, it's 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora, this is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen taku ingoa. The chair of the Auckland DHB admits privilege put him and other board members at the front of the COVID vaccination queue, even though about 50% of its frontline staff are still to get the jab. At a meeting last week, some members of the 11-person board decided to lead from the front and get immunised to set an example, even though according to the government vaccine schedule, it appears they wouldn't be due their shots for months. Some of the board members declined the early opportunity. But board chair Pat Snedden, who took the shot, explains how it came about.
We were at a board meeting the other day and we decided to do it as an aspect of leadership. The opportunity arose because of the fact that we've been very solidly through the frontline staff at ADHB. Pretty much everybody who is in the patient-facing part of ADHB has been offered the vaccination. And we thought that in the context actually of showing confidence in the science and showing confidence in the position, that we would take the opportunity for vaccination when it occurred, and it just happened to occur on the day at the end of the board meeting. So people were able to provide all the necessary privacy information in order to do it, and then if they chose to, and not all the board chose to, but if they chose to, they could get their first shot. So that's how it came about.
How many of the, I think it's 11 board members, isn't it? How many of you had your first jab?
Well, I would suspect probably half of them, but I didn't count, I must say, and because we were dispersed before we got there, I wasn't present for everybody else, so I didn't count them. But, I would suspect probably over half of them for sure.
When you say the opportunity arose at the board meeting, how so? I'm a bit confused by that. What opportunity? Were there vaccine that was going to go to waste?
Not at all. No. Well, basically, we're keeping fairly closely aligned with how the progress of the vaccination is moving out, and we're particularly concerned that those in the front line of the process get access to it first, and that's been happening. It's been happening very successfully. And basically, it was a discussion that was had with the board about the question of leadership and confidence in the science of what we're doing. And so we were as part of regularly being in the hospital and what we do. I'm spending probably half my working week in the hospital at the moment. But you don't have to, though, do you, Pat? You could have meetings off-site. You could use Zoom. You're not like a doctor or a nurse that exactly.
needs to be there.
I understand all of that. But there's no way in which we are preventing people who are right there at the hard end of this getting access to the vaccine. And there is a context here, and it needs to be importantly understood, Lisa, that there's a genuine conversation going on in the New Zealand community, and I admire the fact that it's happening, which is people are asking the question about, is the leadership of this process the sort of thing we need to follow? And I'm saying really clearly, we are confident that the kind of expertise that the Ministry of Health and the advisors are giving us as a board and as a population, that this is the safe and right thing to do, we're prepared to demonstrate that. And an opportunity came, and it was simply this. As we move through the criteria and as we move through the groups of people that were vaccinated, then it was because we're in touch with frontline workers all the time at the DHB, it made sense for us to actually be vaccinated.
But you're not a frontline worker. I'm just looking at the schedule of vaccination, Pat. Where were you due to have your vaccination, looking at that government schedule?
I haven't got it in front of me.
Are you over 65, Pat?
Oh, well, I certainly am, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Between 65 and 74?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, and you're in the second to last group to be vaccinated before the general population.
Except that I'm working in the hospital nearly every day, and so.
But what are you doing in the hospital that makes you a frontline health worker? Because those are the only categories that are right at the top of the list: a frontline border worker, a frontline health worker. So, what frontline health work are you doing?
It's a bit like a minister of the Crown getting the vaccination. And what you're doing here is, because we have a leadership role in this process, we decide to activate that leadership role to show it that, in fact, if people are apprehensive in any way about this vaccine, they ought not to be.
Were the nurses and doctors pushing back against getting vaccinated?
Not at all.
So why did they need to see you get a vaccination as a board member?
Because I'm a leader in the health system. I'm a chair of a board. I'm absolutely showing people that the reason we think this is the right thing to do and for people to get vaccinated en masse is because the science is sound and it's the right thing to do as a citizen.
What date did you get that vaccination, Pat?
Well, at the board meeting last week.
Okay, so did you do some publicity around that? Was there a photo opportunity? Did you put out a newsletter championing the fact that board members had that vaccination and encouraged other people to follow the leadership?
What I did here was, what we all did, was we actually went and talked to people about the fact that this was an important thing to do. And no, we didn't put a big publicity spirit out it. But one of the things you have when you're talking to the population you're in service of is they quite rightly challenge you if you, in fact, are not doing the things you should be doing. And this was a good thing to do, and we chose to do it. Now, you can say, on dancing on the head of a pin, you can say, well, you could have been a week later or something. But actually, the idea that we got in front of anybody else is wrong.
You would have been months later, though, wouldn't you, Pat? Not weeks, months, according to this government schedule.
You're not you're not reading the context. And the context is we made a leadership decision.
When you say you had a discussion and it was decided you should go ahead, do you mean the board members talked about it amongst themselves and decided that you could have an injection if you wanted it?
This would be a good idea, yeah.
Okay. Did anyone think that that was queue jumping, and is that a reason why some of them didn't take the injection?
People had different views about it. And, you know, one of the issues was this in fact getting in front of other people who needed it before us? And the answer was, well, we asked that question, and the answer was, no, you're not. It's an appropriate time to do it. And the information came from our own senior clinical staff. So,
Pat, I just want to be clear on it. So you're saying that some people on the board, 11 board members, how many of them thought that it was queue jumping?
Well, nobody thought that it was queue jumping, but people had a genuine conversation about, is this the right thing to do at this time? And I said to board members, I think it is for myself, and I think that if people wish to do this, then they would be welcome to do it.
So at what point will the entire, frontline staff at Auckland DHB be vaccinated?
Everybody who is in the patient-facing roles in ADHB have been asked to be part of the process of vaccination right now.
So how far through are you, though?
Well, I think there are at least 5,000. We've got 10,500 staff.
So you're only 50% through, yet the board members went to get their vaccinations?
Well, I think the fact that we're 50% through is great.
Pat, is it privileged access?
Is it privileged access? Well, I suppose when you're the board of a DHB, you do get privileged access. Yeah, perhaps. But on the other side of it, is it decent leadership? Surely it is.
And that was Auckland District Health Board Chair Pat Snedden there. It is almost 16 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. And still to come on the program, growers are screaming for Pacific borders to open so they can access critical workers. New Zealand is not only well behind most other countries when it comes to its COVID vaccine rollout, it has also failed to meet its own targets so far. Opposition parties say the government needs to pick up its act. National has leaked ministry documents that show the original targets were even more ambitious, so the failure more stark. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch.
So this is my registration form, my card.
Roll up to the vaccination station and roll up your sleeve. Today it was the Associate Health Minister, Peeni Henre's turn to receive the COVID-19 jab.
Pop it into your left arm.
Sure.
He's one of about 71,000 Kiwis to have been vaccinated under New Zealand's campaign. 19,000 of them have also received a second prick. In total, that's 90,000 doses of the Pfizer vaccine administered to date. A paltry sum when compared worldwide. New Zealanders trailing among OECD countries, the second to last per capita.
India has 5 times the vaccination rate of New Zealand. This is a country that has millions of people in absolute poverty, and they're better organised than the New Zealand Ministry of Health.
Yeah, it seems like everyone goes to sleep in the government as soon as an emergency is passed.
Opposition MPs are piling on the pressure, but the Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, denies New Zealanders performing poorly.
Well, we're in a very different situation from most other countries where they had major community outbreaks and transmission of COVID-19. You know, we have made a very good start to this program. We are delivering a safe program for New Zealanders. We want to build trust and confidence in it, and now it is starting to scale up.
From today, the latest figures on the rollout's progress will be published online, allowing the reality to be measured against a target. Already, DHBs are falling short of those expectations, though not by a huge amount. But National's Chris Bishop says it's actually worse than it looks.
We are just not vaccinating people as quickly as we should be.
He has a leaked document from the Health Ministry, drafted in January. It shows a plan to have 390,000 doses administered by now, 300,000 more than the numbers so far.
It's critical that the government gets the vaccine rollout right, and so far the early signs are not good.
The COVID-19 Minister, Chris Hipkins, says the document's out of date and does not take into account the government's change in strategy to focus solely on the Pfizer vaccine.
Look, they would have been rough working models. There have been a variety of different rough working models all the way through. Things have only really firmed up over the last month or so once we got that extra order for Pfizer confirmed and as we've understood more about when we're expecting to see them delivered.
He says DHBs expect to deliver some 7,500 jabs a day over the next week, and then up to 10,000 a day in the weeks after. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Craig McCulloch.
Well, the National Party's COVID-19 response spokesperson is Chris Bishop, and he joins me now. Good evening, Chris. What evidence have you got that the vaccination program is running behind? Because the Minister says the document you've got is out of date.
Well, certainly the document I've got dated the 26th of January, so it's only a few weeks old. And what it indicates is that by this time, by week 7 in the document, so the week starting April 5, we should have done a cumulative total of around 390,000. And I heard the Minister just in your package saying it doesn't take into account the Pfizer vaccine. The document's all about the Pfizer vaccine. The other pages of the document that I've got show all the Pfizer shipments that are meant to arrive. The document shows that they're meant to arrive on February 15. That's exactly when they did arrive. So it's just, what he says is just wrong, that it doesn't take into account the changed circumstances.
In basic terms, what is this document and how do you know it's authentic?
Well, it's from the Ministry of Health. It is an internal Ministry of Health document. I suspect the Minister has seen it. Certainly we'll be asking questions around whether or not he's actually had access to it, but it's an internal Ministry of Health document that is about the vaccine rollout and about the Pfizer vaccine, when they're meant to arrive into the country, and what the response from the government will be when they arrive. As I say, it goes through the first 2 phases of the rollout, which is for the Group 1 and 2 workers. So this is the critical border workers that we've started vaccinating, obviously. But it also goes through the 12 weeks of what it calls phase 1 of the vaccine rollout, and says by now we should have done 390, and of course we know that we've only done 90, so we're 300,000 short of where we should be according to this document.
The Minister has told this program last night that he's got about 300,000 doses in the fridge, Pfizer doses. So we aren't short of doses. So what do you think the problem is then?
No, I mean, that's exactly right. We've actually got more doses now than the document that I've got says that we would have. So we've actually been over-delivered according to what the Ministry thought we would have back in January 26. But they're just sitting in the fridges. And I think a lot of people out there are wondering, and I'm certainly getting emails from people saying, why can't I get a vaccine when the Pfizer doses are sitting in cold storage around the country? You know, people want to get vaccinated. It's a great sign, obviously.
So why can't they? Do you have any information about whether there are any failures in the delivery program or any particular barriers?
Look, I think a big issue is the IT systems. So there are 4 IT systems that have to be operational before we do the serious rollout of the vaccine, thousands per day. 3 of them are not ready. And the one that is not ready is the national booking system. This is the system that allows you to go on and essentially book your vaccination in. That is still under development. The recall system is still under development as well. That's the system that tells you to come back and get your second dose of the Pfizer vaccine. And the other thing that is still under development, and this is amazing, I can't believe it's true, but it is the inventory management system. That's the system that tracks where the Pfizer vaccine is around the country, the actual physical stocks. The inventory management system is still only under development as well. We're meant to be vaccinating, thousands of people per day very soon, and yet the IT systems are not ready to go.
Do you think that the vaccine should go to the people rather than them being called to particular centres that are being set up?
I don't have a fixed view on exactly how it should work. I think people should be able to book in, and I think that's what the government intends to happen as well. It's just that the IT systems are not ready, and I think one reason for that is they started building them way too late. Many countries started, thinking about the IT requirements a lot earlier than we did. We started basically in September last year. Most countries started earlier than that. Most countries actually ordered the vaccines earlier than we did as well. So we're now facing the cumulative effect of, I think, poor decision-making last year, and of course that has consequences in 2021.
Because the counter-argument is this, that we don't have widespread COVID. We have cases in managed isolation and no community transmission right now. And even when we do, it's relatively contained. So why is it so important to rush this through when we can take our time, and get it right.
I hear that argument and I appreciate that argument. Here's the worry though. The United Kingdom's done over 60%, the United States has done 50%. Lots of other countries are well ahead of us. We're the second worst in the OECD, by the way, the second worst in terms of developed countries. Those countries will quickly start to make decisions around opening up to the rest of the world, and the worry is that the options for New Zealand will quickly diminish and we will be left behind. So I hear the argument that we've done well, and of course we've done really well in tackling COVID-19, but that shouldn't mean that we become complacent around the vaccine rollout. It means that we should quickly do it as fast as possible so that we don't close off our options for the rest of the world in terms of trade and tourism and travel for Kiwis offshore. We've got a fantastic opportunity in New Zealand of starting as COVID-free. Let's start as COVID-free and get the vaccinations done as quickly as possible. And then, look at the opportunities that New Zealand will have with the rest of the world.
Thanks for joining us this evening. That is the National Party's COVID-19 response spokesperson, Chris Bishop. Health Minister Andrew Little says he wants to see vaccination numbers increase to about 10,000 a day by the end of the month. To make that happen, more centres are opening up where people will go to get the jab. Across Auckland, up to 6 large vaccination centres will open in the coming weeks. So far, just one has been operating in the suburb of Highbrook, where 712 people received the shot yesterday alone. Our reporter Nick Trubridge joins us now live from one of the new South Auckland vaccination centres. Nick, where are you and what can you tell us?
Hi Lisa, nice to talk to you. Well, as you can see, I'm at Manurewa Marae in South Auckland. Now, this is one of 2 testing centres that is being, or vaccination centres rather, that is being set up in the south, Lisa. The other is over in Otara, not far from here. And in terms of capacity, this centre, they are saying, is going to be able to vaccinate up to 300 people a day. Now, that's slightly less than the Otara vaccination centre, which will be, well, slightly more than that, up to 200 more to be precise. Up to 500 people a day will be able to be vaccinated at that centre. Now, it's important to note that we are only on Group 2. That's only on Priority Group 2. So they are... The health people here are telling people, do not just turn up, wait for your invitation. Health Group 2 includes people who are working in healthcare as well as people who are vulnerable. So, you know, for example, in this area, that's Māori and Pacifica people who are being cared for by family, as well as people who are in things like care homes and things like that. Now, as for why this area is going first in terms of being the first 2 to be set up after that vaccination centre you've mentioned in Highbrook, that's because this area is in close proximity to one of the main border entries to the country. Of course, those who live in Auckland will know that the airport is not far from here. So they're hitting this area hard first. Of course, me and my colleague Nick Munro have done many reports here about the latest outbreaks that have occurred in the proximity to areas like this. So that's why they're here first. So as you can see behind me, Lisa, all ready to go from tomorrow for Priority Group 2.
Thanks, Nick. That is Nick Trubridge outside one of the new South Auckland vaccination centres. And as he said, you've got to be in one of those priority groups and book ahead. So it's not an all-comers, but it will be open from tomorrow for those with booked spots. A woman who lost her job after her epilepsy drugs were changed without her knowledge has forced a top-level health review. 28-year-old Laura Hume says it was only after her health began deteriorating that she found out she was one of thousands of people who had been switched to a generic drug in a cost-saving drive by Pharmac. Now the Health and Disability Commissioner has found there is a systemic failure in the way brand switches are communicated to patients and has asked Director General of Health Ashley Bloomfield to intervene. Investigative journalist Guyon Espiner reports.
Laura Hume has had epilepsy since the age of 5. It took her until her early 20s to get her seizures under control. But she says her life was then turned upside down in 2019 when Pharmac switched more than 10,000 people taking lamotrigine over to a generic form of the drug.
I was working for the first time in my life. I'd sort of become stable enough and found a job that I could do. I lost that job because I couldn't cope with the stress. I've got a 5-year-old. I can't be going from, yay, I'm doing well, to, oh my gosh, I feel like I just can't do anything.
It was only after Laura Hume's health went downhill that she found out her drugs had been switched. Not only was she in the dark, her doctor was too.
My GP didn't even know about it. I went to him after I'd seen my neurologist and said, this is what's going on, can you help me? And he said, what brand switch?
More than 200 people reported adverse reactions to the lamotrigine brand switch, and the chief coroner is investigating whether 6 deaths were linked to the change. Laura Hume says those caught up in the brand switch fell through the cracks.
If Pharmac was asked, they said it's all in our heads and it's on us. My GP didn't know. My pharmacist, of course, was told it's the same medication, and she's like, okay, yep. Whose monkey is it, basically? Who's responsible for this?
She and 2 others complained to the Health and Disability Commissioner, Morag McDowell. And the Commissioner has now taken those concerns right to the top of the health system.
I believe the complaints show that there is a systemic issue relating to how the brand change was communicated to consumers. And given the potential for ongoing risk and for this to happen again in the future, I've written to the Director General of Health to outline my concerns.
Her letter says she's concerned at the lack of clarity over who is responsible for managing and communicating brand changes to patients, especially brand switches, which can lead to significant side effects. Morag McDowell said GPs often left it to Pharmac to determine whether a brand switch was safe for their patient, or assumed pharmacies would contact them about any significant changes.
In the context of a busy general practice, there is the potential for really important clinical information or clinical points to be lost if GPs are getting inundated with a lot of information about different brand changes.
She has now asked Ashley Bloomfield to work with Pharmac and other agencies to ensure patients get better information when their brand of medicine is changed. Pharmac's Director of Operations, Lisa Williams, says the agency has already introduced a new system for brand switches that allows some patients who cannot tolerate a brand change to stay on their original medicine.
That means that depending on the product, 5% or so of patients could remain on their previously funded brand.
She says Pharmac went to considerable lengths to prepare patients for the lamotrigine brand change, including extending the transition period from 3 to 5 months and offering patients a free GP visit if they needed it. Pharmac says information about the change was widely distributed, and it also engaged with interest groups such as Epilepsy New Zealand. But Lisa Williams says Pharmac is happy to work with the Ministry of Health on improving its systems.
As we do brand changes over the years, what we've learned is that there are small groups of people that brand changes are not successful for whatever reason, and we want to create mechanisms to ensure that people can stay on their previous brands.
But for Laura Hume, the big win is the Health and Disability Commissioner asking the Ministry of Health to design a new system for brand changes.
Hearing that someone is actually listening and willing to say, hey, this actually needs something done about it is huge. Like, we actually have someone backing us up rather than saying, no, it's all in your head, go away.
And this issue won't go away for some time yet. The government has just launched its own review of Pharmac, which includes looking into brand switching, and the Chief Coroner is due to report in the coming weeks. For Checkpoint, ko Guy and Espinatine.
Let's get to some of your feedback now, and a lot of you are getting in touch about the interview we did with Pat Snedden, who is the chair of the Auckland District Health Board. Now, some of those board members had their COVID vaccinations. They had a meeting, they decided that some of them would go early. This person is a DHB frontline worker. They say, I haven't been offered a jab yet. This guy also probably earns as much as 3 nurses while trying to keep the nurses' pay down. I work in community mental health. I don't think Pat would even know where our centre is. Now, he was saying that all frontline staff have been offered the vaccination, but they're only through 50% of the vaccinations. And he estimates about half of the board took the early opportunity to have a vaccination. Di says most people don't even know who the DHB board in Auckland is. That's staff and public. This wasn't leadership, it was queue jumping. Senior doctors and execs and senior nursing staff would have been more convincing, says Di. Another person disagrees though, saying your interviewee works in a hospital every day and wanted to demonstrate confidence in the vaccine by the board. Fair enough. Rob says, so the half of the board that didn't take the jab, they don't want to be leaders? And this one from someone else who says it doesn't matter who gets the jab as long as everyone gets it in the end. Very soon, we will have all had the COVID jab. Coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, the Health Minister supports it, so does the Director General of Health. So why is there no money for a self-swab cervical screening program? The Hollywood director who told New Zealand to steer away from dairy to save the planet is grazing hundreds of cows and calls for an investigation into a mental health report minus critical data. We'd love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program this evening about where we're at on the vaccination program. National Party alleging that we are way behind where we should be, using a leaked document that projects we should have had, I think it was more than 300,000 vaccinations by now. Text us your thoughts, 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It is time now for the headlines with Susanna.
The National Party has published a leaked document it says shows New Zealand has fallen far short of its original target for the COVID vaccine rollout. About 90,000 doses have so far been administered, slightly behind the Health Ministry's official plan. National says a ministry document from January shows a plan to have 390,000 doses administered by now. The COVID-19 response minister says the document is out of date and does not take into account the government's change in strategy to focus solely on the Pfizer vaccine. Meanwhile, the chair of Auckland DHB and other board members managed to get early COVID-19 vaccinations, even though about 50% of its frontline staff are yet to get the jab. Health officials believe the high number of arrivals from India who are testing positive for COVID-19 in managed isolation are getting infected in transit. Of the 7 border cases announced today, 6 had arrived from India via the United Arab Emirates. The Director General of Health says it appears people are getting infected in particular when they're travelling through India to Mumbai or Delhi to catch flights. The Health and Disability Commissioner has found systemic failure in the way Pharmac's medicine brand switches are communicated to patients. Morag McDowell says she is taking action in response to 3 patients' complaints that they were not told Pharmac was switching their brand of epilepsy medicine in 2019. A petition calling for a national women's health strategy has been delivered to MPs. The petitioners want $6 million set aside for the purpose in this year's budget. The lobby group Gender Justice Collective says the health system is failing women because it's based on the needs of a 70-kilogram white male. Cricket, and the White Ferns are chasing 272 runs for victory in the second one-dayer in Mount Maunganui. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. And it's time to get down to business with Nicholas Poynton. First thing you want to talk about is car repossessions. So we're seeing more of them, are we?
Yeah, this has prompted fresh calls for buyers to really do their homework before they pull the trigger and buy a car from a private seller, because the Financial Services Complaints Organisation, they're funded by registered financial service providers. They say people are increasingly having their cars repossessed after they bought them from people who did not disclose that there was still money owed on the vehicle. And I'm sure most people know how this works. If you borrow money to buy a car, the debt is secured against the vehicle. So if you don't pay the money back, the lender can seize the vehicle to cover its debts regardless of who owns it. And the FSCL suspects that the rise in hardship due to COVID-19, that's led to some people selling their cars but choosing not to actually pay their debts. Now, one of the issues here, and it's actually a point of frustration for the FSCL, is that it handles disputes between consumers and lenders, not between consumers and sellers, and there's not actually much it can do to help people who've been caught out in situations like this. They said probably the best available option to people is to try and take legal action against the seller, but often this isn't really a quick fix, because when people are looking to quickly sell their cars, or because they're under hardship and things like that, they can actually disappear. Or they can be hard to really track down. So that's not necessarily straightforward. So the best available option in the view of FSCL is for people to really do their due diligence. Lots of websites like Trade Me, they will actually tell you if a car is sort of owing credit on it, so people can sort of take caution there. But if people are buying vehicles from places like Facebook, or you're walking down the street, you see a car parked up and there's a sign in the window, one of the best things things you can do is actually check the Personal Properties Security Register, and that's a way to see if a car is actually debt-free and hopefully avoid situations like this.
Yeah, that would be a nasty surprise. OK, let's talk about 2 Degrees, and you reckon they're getting a march, or they do, on their competitors?
Yeah, the telecommunications company is now offering free roaming to its business customers in Australia. That means that people who go over there won't face any extra charges if they're on a business plan. So
international roaming, but only in Australia?
Correct. And the reason why this sort of piqued our interest was because a lot of the telcos have taken a bit of a hit during the pandemic because of closed borders. That's because, quite a significant earner for them is the money they make on data roaming plans. It's New Zealanders who are travelling overseas who go on plans and things like that. And alternatively, they're also not making money because of tourists coming to New Zealand who are going to be here for a couple of months. They may need a prepaid phone plan that they need to sign up to while they're touring the country. So, with these talks about a trans-Tasman bubble, that's sort of one way that we can probably see, that's going to have some effect on some of the big telcos in this country. And the other point to really consider is that 2 Degrees has recently hinted that it's got these plans to list on the Australian and the New Zealand Stock Exchange. They are the third biggest telco behind the big boys, Spark and Vodafone. But at the time when we spoke to them when they made this announcement, they really talked up their plans for growth. And one of the areas that they pointed to was that it's made quite an impression in the business space with its business plans. They are quite profitable for telcos. So you can see that this announcement they're making a bit of a play here to really try and grow their market share amongst businesses in New Zealand who may need to travel to Australia.
So are we going to hold our breath and see if the other ones do it?
Well, look, that's the telco space is incredibly competitive, so I would not be surprised if that's the case. We have no real further updates on 2 Degrees' possible IPO plans other than to say that if they do proceed with this, it's going to happen the second half of this financial year.
OK, shall we whip around the market numbers?
Yeah, sure. The NZX is up 87 points to 12,488. The dollar is at 70.5 US cents and 92.1 Australian.
Thanks, Nicholas. Nicholas Poynton with business. The Health Minister has lent his support to self-swabbing smear tests, as has the Director General of Health, Dr Ashley Bloomfield. But the program's still not getting off the ground. Minister Kitty Allen has called on all women to prioritise getting a smear after announcing she has stage 3 cervical cancer. The government's being urged to fund a self-swabbing program that allows women the privacy and convenience of taking a simple test at home. It was due to be rolled out in 2018, but the government put it on ice. Government ministers today acknowledged the value of the program, but wouldn't say when or if they will fund it. Louise Tanuth reports.
It's a do-it-yourself, simple, at-home smear test. Music to the ears of women around the country who may not want to go through the sometimes invasive process they go through at the GPs. Director General of Health, Dr Ashley Bloomfield, says self-sampling could make things significantly easier for women.
We know from a couple of studies that have been undertaken already in New Zealand that has a high degree of acceptability, particularly for Māori women. So that does open up the opportunity for women who may be put off by the current approach to screening, cervical screening, to participate in an HPV-based program.
Associate Minister of Health, responsible for Māori Health, Penny Henare, echoing the call.
We've been talking with Dr Bloomfield and the Ministry of Health for some time now about this particular matter, as well as some of the medical experts with respect to this, and it is, as Dr Bloomfield has already mentioned, currently under consideration by this government, and it's certainly something that I'll be vouching for.
The funding was approved and the program was supposed to start in 2018, but it never did. Last night on Checkpoint, health researcher Professor Dr Beverly Lawton said she's baffled it hasn't happened and says it's a relatively low-cost option.
I can't give you the exact cost, but we were thinking about $40 million over 3 years to put in the technology, which is already outdated and has to be updated, and to roll it out with the program.
When asked where the funding was for self-swabbing cervical smears, Health Minister Andrew Little admitted it's an issue that's been raised for some time.
It's an ongoing piece of work. It's an issue that came across my desk pretty early on as Health Minister, and I'm working with colleagues to do what we can to bring on the self-swabbing.
But he still couldn't say how far away funding could be.
I can't give you a timeline. We know that it requires additional funding. The work is going on to secure. I've been making my calls, if you like.
A cause many women hope will get picked up and approved by Cabinet. For Checkpoint, Louise Tenuth.
Funding for a self-screening program for cervical cancer probably wouldn't be up for debate if it was about men's bodies. That's the view of Te Pāti Māori co-leader Debbie Ngāri-Wapaka. She says the self-smear program should be a priority.
Most likely, if it was a male's body, we wouldn't be having this sort of discussion in the first place. So it is really frustrating.
Do you think it comes down to discrimination?
Yes, I think that's part and parcel of it, absolutely. And I also think that as women, we put everyone else, naturally first. We've got families, we've got, colleagues, we've got work, we've got kaupapa. And in fact, this is exactly what we saw from, a really phenomenal young leader as Kiritapu. So I do think that that's the unfortunate consequences of women, being everywhere and trying to do everything, is that we often don't listen to our bodies.
So the Director General of Health says that this HPV testing is the most effective test available. Andrew Little claims to be working on getting it over the line. Te Rōpū Whakakaupapa Urata, the National Māori Pandemic Group, wrote to the Ministry and Ashley Bloomfield asking for this program to be prioritised. If everyone thinks it's such a good idea, why can't it get over the line?
Exactly. What's the line? I mean, whenever I hear that excuse, it always sort of says the line is what you're responsible for, what we're talking about, the line of bureaucrats or the line of fiscal responsibilities, because either way, the ministers are in charge of those lines. So it's unacceptable that at the moment we've got women that have been affected by this cancer because they just don't want to be fronting up and having that invasive testing done by someone else. So if we can address some of these screening and make it easy to pick up and do at home, why wouldn't we?
When it comes to cervical cancer, Māori women experience that kind of cancer at more than 2 times the rate of non-Māori. How well are Māori women being served when it comes to the current screening program, do you think?
Well, I think there's a whole intersectional aspect with women, full stop, and it is about women, Māori women, transgender women, a whole lot of issues that's loaded up with. But the reality is not very well. There's a huge sense of wakamā, and I think that ability to self-care is almost, sadly, when you're struggling and you have to work and a whole lot of social complexities, self-care is the last thing that a lot of our wahine deal with. So I think that's part and parcel of it. We're not intervening and getting the level of support to be able to self-care early enough. But you would bet if you can get something like this out to wahine, out to poia, who get them out to their aunties, to nieces, then you've got a better saturation of it. But to actually make time to go to the doctors or to a clinic or to get things like that done is the last thing on your list of to do. And that's what we've been hearing. Again, that's what we've seen from a really highly educated, very smart young woman as Kiri. We saw it with Tale Morrison and a huge movement of smear your mare. And sadly, that it's coming down to the innovation of women to actually promote that they do this versus let's just get a tool and get it out into those families so that we can actually self-test.
Te Pāti Māori co-leader Debbie Ngāri-Wapaka. While today women took to Parliament's steps to call out sexism in health, demanding a women's health strategy, the Gender Justice Collective handed over a petition to MPs from across the political spectrum. It wants a $6 million injection in the budget for an overhaul of health services they say are failing women, trans and non-binary people. Political reporter Yvette McCullough was there.
A spotlight's been shone on women's health after Minister Kiri Allen revealed she has stage 3 cervical cancer. It was on the mind of Angela Meyer from the Gender Justice Collective as she handed over the petition calling for a women's health strategy.
I don't know Kiri well, but I know that I was very upset to read that. And I also know that for many women in this country, that is an everyday reality. Too many women are dying. We have too many petitions coming to Parliament. You're standing out here on the steps, receiving yet another petition.
She says there are many reasons why a national women's health strategy is needed.
But number one, because we are not a niche, we are the majority, and we really want to make sure that New Zealand is leading the world in gender equity.
Ms Meyer points out that in the last year alone, 10 petitions relating to women's health were delivered to Parliament. She says now is the time for a comprehensive overhaul, and she's calling for $6 million to be put aside in the budget to kickstart this work.
That equates to $2.60 per woman in Aotearoa.
Ms Meyer says one problem is the health system in New Zealand is based on a 70-kilogram white man.
Women's bodies are complicated. That's often what they're said. And so it's very easy to go, OK, we're going to put that in the too hard basket. Now, whether that's sexism, whether that's the patriarchy, well, I think it's both of those things, if I'm really honest. And I think this is where we're actually calling it out, we're naming it, and we're saying we want better.
Labour MP Lewis Wall says women are falling through the very clear gaps in the health system.
We have some challenges in front of us, but we also have opportunities, and I really want to thank you for your work, because underlying all of it is, I guess, the dismantling of sexism, and you're holding us accountable as women parliamentarians, but as a parliament, to specifically meeting the needs of women.
For Māori Party co-leader Debbie Ngārewa-Paka, the petition highlights an extremely important issue.
It's really great that you're bringing and lifting the wakamā or the shame off this, and us being able to talk about it and certainly take it to the corridors, which it's a shame that some of our tāne think that something's wahine. They don't turn up to support us here this morning. So we've got a long way to go.
Green MP Jan Logie says while a strategy is not the easiest thing to get people to rally behind, in this case it's vital.
And I think it calls to actually us taking this seriously rather than picking things that are easy and quick and isolated but may have an immediate appeal, because that's not going to address the depth of the problems that we've got across our health system and across the way we've organised our society.
Angela Meyer says values are shown through what people are willing to spend money on, and she's calling on the government to show it values the health of women. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Yvette McCullough.
It is 10 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen, and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. And after 6 tonight, the Hollywood director who was vocal about New Zealand ditching dairy is grazing hundreds of cows. Judith Collins wants an investigation into what she calls the strange and unusual behaviour displayed by health officials compiling a report on the mental health system. The National Party leader is calling for the Public Service Commissioner to take a look after it was revealed a month's delayed annual report was drastically trimmed and edited. Information released to news website Stuff shows staff at the Ministry of Health asked for certain details to be removed, including data on suicide, before it was published publicly. Here's political reporter Katie Scotcher.
Pages and pages of correspondence between officials show they were concerned data set to be included in 2018 and 2019 annual mental health reports was too negative. Officials discussed removing information and shortening the report. They also discussed not being legally required to produce it. This has concerned National leader Judith Collins, who says she'll be asking the Public Service Commissioner to investigate.
Well, the information that we have, which actually suggests that there has been some very strange and unusual behaviour from some senior public servants trying to hold back information on mental health statistics that they found negative.
Sean Robinson's the head of the Mental Health Foundation. He says the documents paint a picture of unaccountability and a lack of transparency.
Whether that's by design or by neglect and foolishness, either way, it doesn't bear well for the transformation of mental health that we're trying to achieve.
As for the National Party's complaints to the Public Service Commissioner, Mr Robinson says they need to tread carefully.
A lot of the issues that we're dealing with now come from 10 years of complete neglect of mental health while they held the reins of power. So, I don't think they can sit on the moral high ground very far up that hill.
The Director General of Health says he's comfortable with how the mental health annual report was handled. He's also defending the ministry staff who removed the information from it, saying they were trying to ensure the data presented wasn't also reported elsewhere.
And I think if you look at the report that's just come out with the latest data, it is still very comprehensive. There is a lot of data in there.
Health Minister Andrew Little is also fine with the delay in releasing the report, but has some questions.
There are some things that I question why aren't in there. The deaths that have to be reported under Section 132 of the Mental Health Compulsory Assessment and Treatment Act. Not quite sure why that was omitted. I understand there's a question about some of the accuracy of data previously.
He says there could be some merit in looking at why that specific data wasn't included.
I'm not quite sure whether that's a Public Service Commission responsibility or, more likely a Mental Health and Wellbeing Commission responsibility, because they have a responsibility to make sure data is being collected, that it has integrity and that it's being reported.
Mr Little says officials are looking at what information is reported across the sector and if there are any gaps that need plugging. Tuiti whari parimata mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Katie Scott Churaho.
Jailed Russian opposition activist Alexei Navalny is reported to be suffering symptoms of respiratory illness and fever in the penal colony where he's been imprisoned. He started a hunger strike last week and his health is now worsening. Supporters of Mr Navalny gathered outside the jail and several were arrested. The BBC's Sarah Rainsford reports.
She came to call for help for Russia's most famous prisoner. Dr. Anastasia is a close ally of Alexei Navalny, and he's complaining of acute pain, demanding to see a medic he can trust.
I just want to speak with the chief of this prison.
She walked right up to the prison gates. Beyond them, the opposition politician's been on hunger strike for 6 days now. Extra police had been drafted in. Every person there, including the press, was captured on camera.
This is the prison where Alexei Navalny is being held behind these walls. Now, we can't go any further, but he has been getting messages out via his lawyers, and in each one of them, he's been talking about how his health is deteriorating, and his supporters are increasingly worried.
I'm really very afraid of his health and his condition. Just don't want to let his health be worse, and that's why I'm here now.
Do you trust the prison doctor?
No.
It was just last summer that Vladimir Putin's fiercest critic collapsed on a flight from Siberia. He was treated in Germany, where doctors found traces of a military-grade nerve agent. Alexei Navalny returned to Russia, only to be arrested at the border. But if the Kremlin hoped he'd be silenced behind bars, he's defied that.
Sarah Rainsford reporting. When more bones were found 3 metres deep in the earth during a road construction project, it was heralded as a discovery of great significance. At a pre-dawn ceremony, those bones were uplifted from the site and moved to Te Manawa, the Palmerston North Museum. But for some, this is just the start now. Lab tests and investigations can date the bones and find out more about the extinct species. Our reporter Harry Locke and cameraman Dom Thomas were given a sneak peek.
The bones arrived at Te Manawa under the cover of darkness very early this morning. They were carried inside wrapped-up boxes, laid out on the floor with iwi members, Kaitiaki representatives and Waka Kotahi Transport Agency staff all sat around. The bones were welcomed with a karakia and waiata. The bones were then carried out to the rear of the museum into a storage room. Many of them, too fragile and too sensitive to be moved out of their boxes, remained wrapped up. But we were given a chance to see 3 of the moa bones. The bones were found during the earthworks of the Te Ahu Aturanga State Highway project. Now, if I just show you here, what we're looking at here is 2 sides of a tibia bone, and this one is measuring around 35 centimetres in length. And here we've got a femur, which is the moa's upper thigh bone. Now, there were other bones that were discovered within the same vicinity, but those haven't yet been determined what they are. Terry Happy is the Poutiaki Taio, coordinating the Kaitiaki to the various sites across the region which require monitoring. He was called to the find shortly after they were first discovered on March 9th.
The area in which they were found in a gully, and the depth at which they were discovered which was about 3 to 4 metres below an existing pond, based on that and the material that they were found in. So we knew this was like virgin ground, and it was quite ancient in its form and what it looked like.
Hapi, who is also the deputy chair of the Rangatane o Manawatu Settlement Trust, says finds such as these are of huge importance.
Knowing that, Moa were last walking this earth around about 600 years ago, way before our people even came to Aotearoa. So it's a very sacred and significant find for us.
Archaeologist Patrick Hasvelt was also called onto the site on that day to confirm the discovery.
The bones were not found articulated, meaning they weren't. The lower leg bone wasn't immediately connected to the upper leg bone, and vice versa. So that we were dealing with a scatter over several square meters in floor area, and so that meant that something had redeposited them before the accumulation of soil over time. So perhaps a scavenger.
Lonnie Dalzell from Wakakotahi is overseeing the project.
Finds aren't unusual, but the moa bones in this area are. It's the first time that the moa bones have been discovered in the area, so their significance is quite high. But generally our large earthworks projects do find things, and we have a process usually in place to be able to ensure they're protected and follow tikanga.
While much of what we can learn from the moa bones is still to come, there were some early deductions archaeologist Hasvelt made.
My role as the archaeologist was to check for evidence of human activity in association with the moa bones. We did not find any evidence of butchery marks on the exposed bones as we were finding them. So that we've determined that it is, in fact, a natural deposit.
Now in the labs, there will be pollen analysis samples and radiocarbon dating to glean further information from the bones. From Palmerston North, for Checkpoint, Harry Locke.
And if you were listening to that story from Harry and cameraman Dom Thomas, if you're listening on radio, we'll put the video up online. Check it out.
RNZ News at 6, ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leata tēnei. The chair of the Auckland DHB admits privilege put him and other board members at the front of the COVID vaccination queue, but insists it's also decent leadership. About half the DHB's frontline hospital staff have been vaccinated, and last week some of the 11 board members decided they would be too. Chairperson Pat Snedden has defended the move, telling Checkpoint it's not queue jumping. He's comparing it to the government ministers who've been getting early shots.
And what you're doing here is, because we have a leadership role in this process, we decide to activate that leadership role to show it that, in fact, if people are apprehensive in any way about this vaccine, they ought not to be.
Pat Snedden says he's not aware of any doctors or nurses who are reluctant to get the vaccine. Health officials believe the high number of people testing positive for COVID-19 after arriving on flights from India are getting infected in transit. A negative pre-departure test has been required for most arrivals since January. The Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, says it's something that has been looked into, and there doesn't appear to be an issue with the pre-departure tests. Instead, people are getting infected on their way to New Zealand, in particular when travelling across India to catch flights from Mumbai or Delhi. The National Party says New Zealand has fallen far short of its original target for the vaccine rollout. About 90,000 doses have so far been administered, but National's COVID response spokesperson Chris Bishop says a leaked ministry document from January shows a plan to have 390,000 doses administered by now. He says the rollout has been pathetic, with New Zealand ranked second last in the OECD per capita. The COVID-19 response minister Chris Hipkins says the out-of-date document does not take into account the government's change in strategy to focus solely on the Pfizer vaccine. The European Union has denied blocking further shipments of vaccine destined for Australia. Earlier this year, Italy held back 250,000 doses in order to cope with its own shortage. Here's the ABC's Linton Besser.
On Tuesday, Scott Morrison said one reason for Australia's sluggish vaccine rollout was due to missing shipments of the AstraZeneca vaccine containing more than 3 million doses. In March, the EU stopped the export of 250,000 doses to Australia. But overnight, Eric Mamer, the EU spokesman, said it had only ever blocked the one shipment. An EU official told the Reuters news agency that 7 shipment requests were currently under review, but none of them were destined for Australia.
Linton Besser reporting. Amnesty International says the pandemic has brutally exposed and deepened inequalities around the world. Its annual report published today says the worst impact has been on the most vulnerable people, including refugees and migrants. Amnesty's Secretary-General Agnes Kalamar says during the pandemic there has also been an increase in police violence in some countries.
Even in countries that did not have this virulent strain, we have found a tendency among governments to instrumentalize COVID in order to normalize emergency powers.
Agnes Kalamar of Amnesty International. Malaysia's former Prime Minister has been served with bankruptcy notice for failing to pay $400 million in unpaid taxes between 2011 and 2017 while still in office. Najib Razak has described the move as an attempt to destroy his political career. He's already appealing against his convictions for corruption and money laundering in connection with the suspected theft of billions of dollars from a state fund he co-founded. If declared bankrupt, Mr Najib would lose his seat as an MP and not be able to stand in upcoming elections. It's 4 minutes past 6. White Fern spinner Lee Kasperek has made a strong return to the New Zealand one-day cricket team, snaring her best bowling figures of 6 for 46 as Australia reached 271 for 7 in the second one-dayer in Mount Maunganui. Kasperek told Spark Sport at the innings break that despite her efforts, Australia's total will take some getting.
Maybe a little bit more than we would have liked them to get, but I think we managed to peg it back when they got off to a really good start. So, hopefully our batters can chase it down.
However, New Zealand have already lost early wickets and a short time ago were 25 for 2 after 4 overs. The injury-hit Highlanders have suffered another blow. Halfback Folau Fakatava is out of rugby for the rest of the year with a knee injury picked up in last Friday's game against the Crusaders. Otago halfback James Ascot has been called into the squad as a replacement. An Australian Christian lobby group has launched a campaign calling for Israel Folau to be allowed to return to the National Rugby League. Folau, who's played league, union and Aussie rules, was sacked by Rugby Australia in 2019 over social media posts deemed homophobic. A return to the NRL with St George was scuppered in February after news of negotiations sparked a backlash. A full-page ad from the lobby group published in Sydney's Daily Telegraph newspaper says Folau was subjected to a double standard as players with criminal convictions and antisocial behaviour were allowed to keep playing. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Chris Bumby continues his chat on the science, or lack of it, of sci-fi energy. Fossils from Lost Worlds is this week's Hump Prize, and there's a sofa session with Ingrid and the Ministers.
I got back a little piece of me.
On Nights of me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7.
Not sure it's the peace I need.
On RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from east to midnight tomorrow: Northland to Taranaki, Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Taupo. Fine spells, isolated showers clearing south of Auckland tonight, isolated showers returning in the south tomorrow afternoon. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa, partly cloudy, a few showers about Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, mainly about the ranges. Isolated afternoon showers in Wairarapa tomorrow. Taihape to Wellington, also Marlborough, Nelson, Buller and Westland, fine apart from areas of cloud or fog morning and night. Also isolated afternoon and evening showers about and north of Manawatu tomorrow. Canterbury and Otago, excluding Clutha, fine apart from areas of cloud with patchy drizzle for the coast and Canterbury Plains, clearing tomorrow morning. Clutha, Southland and Fiordland, cloudy periods, a few showers about the fields and the south coast. Chatham Islands, fine spells. RNZ National, it's 7 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just joining us, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. James Cameron's plans to convert his Wairarapa properties into organic veggie farms appear to have fallen short, with hundreds of cows now understood to be grazing in his paddocks. The Avatar film director owns more than 1,500 hectares of land in South Wairarapa and has been outspoken about the need for New Zealand to move away from agriculture to curb carbon emissions. But locals say that he's not walking the talk, with plans for crop farming giving way to more lucrative dairy grazing. Nita Blake-Person reports.
As a film director, James Cameron is all about creating fantasy worlds, full of blue, beauty and wonder.
I think Avatar was certainly the longest and the most complex film that I've ever made.
Back on Earth, he tries to keep things green and has worked on environmental causes for decades.
Every single action matters. And when combined with billions of others around the world, these actions can become unstoppable.
But on his farm in Wairarapa, in addition to the blue and green, things are becoming a lot more black and white.
We see a few livestock. They look to be young dairy cattle, black and white predominantly, in what used to be called Mackland Farms, which used to be a farm that we farmed in the late 80s and early 90s.
That's Denise McKenzie. She lives with her husband next to the Cameron family farm near Featherston. Denise used to own some of the property the Camerons now farm and says there was plenty of interest when they first came to town.
We had been involved with livestock. Initially we had sheep and beef, and then we converted the top end of the farm to dairy and then ran bull beef in the bottom end of the farm, and didn't really have much crop growing at that time. So for anybody coming in and specifically wanting to grow new sort of crops and vegetables, which was their emphasis, we thought, well, this is going to be interesting to watch just to see how successful it's going to be.
Organic crops had been the number one aim for the Camerons. They shut down 2 dairy farms to begin their new operation. Here's what their website says.
Cameron family farms are dedicatedly leading the next generations of eco-warriors and farmers towards large-scale animal-free organic eco-agriculture.
And it was a plan they were obviously excited about.
We want to live here the rest of our lives and continue to raise our children here. This is our home.
That's James Cameron speaking alongside his wife Susie at a Just Transitions Energy Summit in Taranaki nearly 2 years ago.
And I just want to say, we're farmers. You know, we have a large working farm in the Wairarapa, south of Featherston. We grow flax, corn, hemp, industrial hemp, and maybe the other kind in a year or so if things go well in this referendum. We have a large organic vegetable operation.
They were touting the benefits of moving New Zealand away from animal products, a task as tricky as turning the Titanic, but a cause they obviously cared about.
Elephant in the room here, or the cow in the room here, is obviously animal agriculture. You can't really talk about reducing emissions in New Zealand without talking about the future of ag and food.
Here he is again, speaking to TVNZ's Sunday programme in 2019.
I think what we see is that the rivers and the lakes are extremely polluted here. That New Zealand isn't living up to its own image of itself right now, and the image that it projects to the world as the clean, green place. So there's a lot of work to do here to steward the land properly.
But fast forward 2 years, and according to Wairarapa locals, those words are starting to sound like a bunch of hot air.
He's got dairy support, as far as I understand. They graze the cattle there, and to my understanding, there is quite a large number.
Jim Headley has been a dairy farmer in Wairarapa for nearly 50 years. He says there are hundreds of cows on the Cameron family farm, and they've had cattle grazing on the property since mid-last year. While he says they're not milking, James Cameron is certainly falling short on his promise to move away from agriculture.
Pushing vegan, yet making money out of beef or dairy cattle.
Checkpoint contacted many South Wairarapa residents for this story. Most did not want to speak, citing non-disclosure agreements they'd signed due to connections with the Cameron family farms.
But some were happy to provide background, saying they were frustrated by the Camerons' public claims compared to what was the reality. However, they did note the farms had moved to get away from agriculture, that there was no intensive stock grazing taking place, and that the staff did an excellent job with the property. But neighbour Denise McKenzie says it's not clear what the farming operation does these days.
There were a lot of organically grown vegetables and crops. I think hemp was grown for the oil, flaxseed oil was grown. There were some big silos that were erected, so we presumed that those sorts of seed crops and crops that could be turned into oils for cooking with were going to increase. But over the last year, nothing seems to be happening in that side of things.
She says the organic vegetable shop in Greytown that was supplied by the farm has shut down, and progress on the crop side of things appears to have ground to a halt.
I think they were unrealistic given the sort of climate and conditions, particularly in this area, that you would ever run a farm without animals. We're all interested in each other's properties and what people are doing, and it's not being nosy, it's just kind of the Kiwi way in farming communities. People like to sort of learn from each other and look over the fence and see what somebody else is doing, and at the moment we're just not sure what's going on, and that's our concern, really. Is it all going to crank up again eventually, or has it stopped indefinitely, or what is happening?
Jim Headley says it comes down to making a buck, and dairy grazing is more lucrative than veggies. But he says if anyone can afford to swallow those costs, it's the Camerons.
He can afford, as I understand, he can afford to not make a profit on the place. We all have to make a profit on our places.
And he says Mr Cameron might do well to look at his own carbon emissions before taking aim at farmers.
He travels back to America and so forth. He needs to look at his carbon footprint when he's doing that, and perhaps he looks in taking a rowboat back to America when he goes back, so he lowers his carbon footprint.
Checkpoint has tried to contact the Camerons for this story for over a week, but has yet to receive a response. While James Cameron was in New Zealand last year to work on the latest Avatar films, it's understood he's since returned to the United States. For Checkpoint, Coordinator Blake Person, aho.
Fruit, meatworks and food processing industries are calling on the government to open Pacific borders to tackle what they're calling their worst ever labour crisis. At a media conference in Napier, they demanded more government help. Our Hawke's Bay reporter Tom Kitchen has more.
That's the sound of walking through a row of apple trees. But in this case, the apples aren't on the trees. They're rotting on the ground. This is a reality Hawke's Bay orchardist Bruce Mitchell is facing after his toughest season ever. He says he couldn't find enough pickers to pick his royal galas.
The apple crop that you see here represents 10 to 12 months of planning, investment and work. And just days before I came to pick it, I had 20 pickers signed up, and at induction 2 pickers turned up. So we went into crisis mode.
He says this is the worst his family has ever seen. My
family's been involved for over 5 decades, and we've never experienced a crisis like this where we've had to walk away from, whole blocks of export apples. We've got export markets that are crying out for this fruit, and we just can't get it harvested.
Orchardist John Bostock says the government's intentions to get Kiwis on board didn't work as well as anticipated. He's calling for a plan from the government, and they want it sooner rather than later.
We simply haven't got enough available New Zealanders to do the job. And it's very, very tough, and we're calling on the government to open the Pacific for open the borders for COVID-free countries to come and work in New Zealand for next year.
It's not only the fruit growers in Hawke's Bay that are feeling the heat. The problems affect many industries. Craig Hickson of Progressive Meats says his company's also short of staff.
This has been the most difficult and most challenging, worst experience with regard to having sufficient people at work. We, in fact, have been short of workers right through the peak lamb season, which is a little bit longer than the apple season, and we still remain short today.
Bruce Mackay, the agricultural manager at the Watties factory in Hastings, says he's facing difficulties too.
We're having to deal with erratic supply of product coming to the factory. We're having to deal with
staff absenteeisms on a grand scale each day.
After the government announced a trans-Tasman bubble yesterday, many have asked the question, why can't the borders open to the Pacific Islands? National Party leader Judith Collins is calling for an immediate travel bubble with the Pacific for these reasons.
These countries are being extraordinarily hard hit by the lack of tourism, but also the RSE workers who we have working in New Zealand or have been. They are absolutely crucial to the economies of these countries.
Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says a trans-Tasman bubble should open up some space in MIQ.
Now that we don't have the trans-Tasman bookings, about 1,000 worth, we will be looking at whether or not some of those places can be taken by other low-risk travellers, and specifically the Pacific. So we are working on whether or not that might ease some pressure for horticulture.
She also says it's not just a case of New Zealand wanting travel, the other side has to agree.
Other countries, they're not even allowing, in some cases, their citizens to return. So it's actually not just a decision of New Zealand. There are many Pacific neighbours who are part of our RSE schemes who do not want open borders at this point.
Meanwhile, up the coast on Hawke's Bay orchards, the rotting fruit is piling up. E te matou a Maui mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi ko Tom Kitchener.
It's 19 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. A members' bill that would remove alcohol sale restrictions over Easter, on Christmas Day and Anzac Day is gaining momentum with a push to use a new rule to get it before Parliament. Labour's Kieran McAnulty's bill would change the law so licensed businesses already allowed to open on those days could sell alcohol. Under a new standing order, a members' bill can go straight to the top of the order paper if it has the backing of at least 61 MPs who are not ministers. Previously, a bill had to be pulled from the ballot, but that could be bypassed under the new rule. Kieran McAnulty explained his reasoning for the law change to reporters at Parliament.
It's not my intention to allow bottle stores to open when they currently cannot. It's not my intention to allow supermarkets to open when they currently cannot. That's a much bigger question. I'm just looking at the hospitality businesses that operate, particularly in high demand areas, high tourist areas, that are operating under heavy restrictions at the moment. But if they were able to operate under the normal rules, it would benefit those businesses, it would benefit the areas that we are encouraging people to visit. It would be an economic benefit to those regions, but we wouldn't be requiring more workers to work because they are not covered by my bill.
What is your message to MPs around this place to get on board with you?
I'd encourage them to do so. The RSA, for example, has expressed support for this because they recognise that their individual clubs have to go through this rigmarole every year of applying for a special licence. If my bill passes, they can just operate and ensure that those that attend Anzac Day services can come to the RSA and have a pint with their comrades and talk about the old days and celebrate Anzac Day. But this is a conscience debate. I'm not going to put undue pressure on anyone. I would just appeal to them that, first of all, I'd like them to support it so that we can bypass the ballot and debate this in the House. But second of all, realise that this isn't actually overreaching into areas that no one wants to consider at the moment. It's just focusing on those businesses that can already operate and make it easier for them in the areas where they operate.
Your colleague, Penny Henare, is not comfortable as a Māori health minister with making it easier to drink alcohol on more days of the year. Are you a little bit up against it with people who will look at it from that approach?
I respect his view. He's a really measured and considered bloke and a mate of mine, so I respect his view. I don't agree with it because we're at the moment, we've got a situation where the law is actually encouraging stockpiling of alcohol, which I don't think anyone would agree was a good idea. On Holy Thursday and on Easter Saturday, there are lines of trolleys at the supermarket of people chock-a-block full of booze because they can't buy it the next day. And I think we can all agree that there's many of examples of us buying more booze than we need, and it's just sitting there ready to go. But also, the other example is that if you go to a pub on Easter Sunday, you've got a 2-hour window where you can drink an hour before you have a feed and an hour after you have a feed. That's actually kind of like a mini 6 o'clock closing. That encourages binge drinking. I wouldn't want to support that.
Labour MP Kieran McAnulty talking about his members' bill at Parliament. Australia is falling well behind its planned COVID vaccine target of 4 million doses by April, with just under 900,000 jabbed so far. Prime Minister Scott Morrison is pinning it on supply problems, saying the importation of 3.1 million doses has been blocked. The country's also manufacturing the AstraZeneca vaccine, but has yet to reach its goal of producing 1 million doses a week. Marie-Louise McLaws is an epidemiologist and a member of the WHO COVID Infection Prevention Committee. She told the ABC's Sally Sara it could be a year before Australia can safely reopen to the rest of the world.
We are getting left behind, but let me just put it into perspective. So we're now up to week 6. We've got 3.3 people per 100 receiving 1 dose. In the UK, at their 3 weeks, they were 6.7, nearly 7 people. And of course, in the US, they were 7.4 people per 100. So we're at the halfway mark to those 2 countries. And of course, Israel powered ahead and won that particular race at about 55 people per 100 and did particularly well. So we need to catch up by increasing our daily dosing by 7 times. And overall, we need at least 133,000 doses given per day for the next 270 days, and we'll still have a group that won't have received their second dose until between January and March next year.
What does the world look like for Australia, say, 6 months from now? Will other countries be opening up and being able to move more freely than us? Will we be left behind in a way?
That will give us around September, and we won't be able to open up our borders any faster than we are now for people returning, residents and citizens returning to Australia, because by September we won't have given every single person that wants to have the vaccine a dose. I've estimated that based on around 10% of people receiving Pfizer and 90% receiving AstraZeneca, that we'll need about 85% of the population being vaccinated to get herd immunity. So it will take us till the end of the year to get 1 dose for most people, and then thereafter there'll be about 70,000 doses per day for 3 months to cover everybody with that second dose. So we won't be able to open up really until maybe April, May next year.
And that was epidemiologist Marie-Louise McLaws speaking to the ABC. The New South Wales government says it aims to dish out 60,000 doses a week, but it will depend on the federal government supplying the vaccine. The Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, has announced it's setting up a mass vaccination clinic at Sydney's Olympic Park, which will be capable of doing 30,000 vaccine doses a week. But delays in the rollout of the vaccine are causing concern for some aged care residents and their families. The ABC's Samantha Donovan reports.
6 weeks into Australia's rollout, and Melbourne woman Angela still doesn't know when her husband will get his COVID-19 vaccination at his aged care facility.
I've been told absolutely nothing. And John hasn't been told anything either. Most disappointing, yes.
And she's particularly worried that those caring for her husband haven't had their injections either.
Workers who have young families and they have endless contact are a real worry, and they should be vaccinated immediately.
On its Facebook page, grassroots lobby group Aged Care Reform Now asked its members to let it know if their loved one in aged care had been vaccinated, as well as the facility's staff. Here are some of the responses.
No for my mother, and an email just received from the manager states that there is still no indication of a timeline for when vaccinations might occur.
Just received an email from the facility advising it's been delayed for staff and residents with no date as yet.
Neither residents nor staff. We are constantly being updated by management, who are increasingly frustrated by this.
Our residents had 1 jab last week, but staff are not being vaccinated at this stage.
We've been told any time in the next 12 weeks. We have 150 residents and over 200 staff.
This needs to be resolved quickly. Half of staff not vaccinated either. Shocking statistics.
Sachin Patel is a GP and the founder of Aged Care GP. It provides medical care to people living in aged care facilities in Melbourne. He's not surprised Phase 1A of the rollout is going slowly.
It had disaster written over it because it cut out the main people who know aged care, which is GPs. You've got a new vaccine, you've got people being contracted to deliver that in an environment they're not familiar with.
What do you think is delaying the rollout? Is it the supply of the Pfizer vaccine, which is being used in aged care, or do these private contractors not have enough staff to send teams in to multiple sites a day?
We've had multiple reports of vaccines turning up, but no one to actually administer them, so them being either sent back or discarded. The other is, I'm not sure that people have really thought through the logistics of vaccine delivery at speed in an aged care facility. And then there's a whole group that's been missed. There are something like 10 to 15% of residents who don't get vaccinated when the team visits out of the facility on that particular day at a hospital appointment, or maybe they were unwell slightly, and there's no mechanism for those people to have a catch-up vaccination.
And Dr Patel is also concerned that the rollout's original plan to vaccinate staff is also falling by the wayside.
And that was Samantha Donovan reporting there. Lots of feedback from you all on the Auckland DHB interview. That was with the board chair, Pat Snedden. And this is about some of the board members taking the decision to go get their vaccinations really ahead of schedule, when 50% of their staff are still waiting to get theirs. Christine says, read the DHB board queue jumping. How are the GPs getting on with vaccinations? DHBs are in a position to bandy vaccines around, but it seems to be more difficult for the primary sector's front line to access the jabs. I think DHBs should be taking more of a team of genuine frontline workers approach, especially if the New Zealand Aussie bubble goes ahead and we end up with another community outbreak. Thanks, Christine. Someone else says Pat Snedden's excuse that it was a leadership decision smacks of him being the leader and him deciding that he should get vaccinated before his time. Most definitely opportunistic. Another person says shame on the DHB board members who jumped the queue ahead of their own staff that haven't been vaccinated yet. Privilege? Definitely. Abuse of privilege? Definitely, this listener says. Shame on you and good on those board members that declined. Generally on the rollout, this listener says, the Director General of Health makes the important point that COVID is rife in other countries but absent here. I'm quite happy to wait and give preference to people who are actually at risk. On cervical smears and the do-it-yourself kits, this person says surely there must be significant savings for women to self-test rather than have a nurse do it. Perhaps the increased costs, if they're real, would relate to a higher take-up, and surely that would be a good thing, says Patricia. Another person says it's not a discrimination issue, the self-administered smears. The issue is that we already pay through general practice. Back tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Health officials believe the high number of people testing positive for COVID-19 after arriving here on flights from India are getting infected in transit. Meanwhile, the US has ruled out introducing so-called vaccination passports for people who have been vaccinated against COVID-19. The Health and Disability Commissioner has found systemic failure in the way Pharmax medicine brand switches are communicated to patients. A Labour MP is seeking support for a members' bill removing restrictions on the sale of alcohol over Easter and on Christmas Day and Anzac Day. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
I think for travel to Australia, the risk is now very similar to travel within New Zealand.
Live with local, national and international stories as they happen.
There's been a smile on my face all day and probably smiles on faces of a lot of people around New Zealand, not just tourism operators, but family, friends as well.
Up to date if you're up late. Lately with Karen Hay every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
Thanks, Karen, and I'm Brian Crump, getting ready for another night on RNZ National, where my first guest after the news at 7 is